He was on the ground, not kneeling, not bowing, on the ground, because his body had finally given out beneath him. His hip was wrong now. Something inside the joint had shifted, and he would feel it with every step for the rest of his life. The sky over the Jabbok was beginning to turn grey at the edges. Dawn was coming, and the one he had been holding onto all night was ready to leave. But Jacob wouldn't let go. Bleeding, exhausted, broken in the socket, he tightened his grip and said the only thing a desperate man knows how to say: "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And here is where the strangest moment in the entire story happens. Not the wrestling, not the injury, not the mysterious figure. Something quieter than all of that. Because the one he was clinging to didn't answer the request. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He asked a question. "What is your name?" Stop there. Sit in that for a second. Because that question should not exist. This is the God who knew Jacob before he was born. The God who watched two children struggle inside Rebekah's womb and told of us that the older would serve the younger. The God who met this same man years earlier at Bethel, at the bottom of a ladder full of angels, and called him by name: "I am the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac." He knew. He always knew. He knew the name, the history, the lie, the running, the fear. So why ask? You don't ask a question to gather information you already have. So if God wasn't asking to learn the answer, then the question wasn't really a question at all. It was something else. Something aimed straight at the man in the dirt. The real mystery of this scene was never who was wrestling Jacob. It was this. What did God want Jacob to do by saying his own name out loud? And if you sit with that long enough, you start to realize the answer changes everything you thought this story was about. Before we go any further, if you love the moments in Scripture that most people read straight past without stopping, the small details that quietly rearrange the whole picture, then take 1 second right now and subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this. The verses hiding in plain sight. Now, back to the riverbank. Because to understand why this question mattered so much, we have to go somewhere unexpected. We have to leave the river. We have to go back decades. Back to a tent and a dying old man, and the last time someone asked Jacob who he was. It's in Genesis 27. And once you see it, you will never read the Jabbok the same way again. Isaac is old. His eyes have failed him. He can no longer see the faces of his own sons. He wants to bless his firstborn before he dies, so he sends Esau out to hunt and prepare a meal. But while Esau is gone, Rebekah dresses her younger son in his brother's clothing, covers his smooth arms with goat skin, and sends Jacob in to steal the blessing meant for someone else. And the blind old father, hearing footsteps, reaches out into the dark and asks the exact question: "Who are you, my son?" Listen to what Jacob says. "I am Esau, your firstborn." He didn't just lie, he erased himself. Standing in front of his own father, asked point blank to identify himself, Jacob answered by claiming to be another man entirely. When Jacob was asked, "Who are you?" he responded with a name that wasn't his. Now come back to the river. Decades later, a different night, a different figure in the dark, and the same question, asked again in almost the same words: "What is your name?" The first time he was asked who he was, Jacob gave the wrong answer on purpose. And now, at the end of the longest night of his life, God is asking it again, as if to say, Let's try this once more. Only this time there is no disguise, no goatskin, no borrowed clothes, no blind father to deceive. This time, the one asking can see everything, and this time there is only one answer Jacob can give. Do you feel the trap closing? This was never about information, it was about identity. God was walking Jacob back to the exact question he had failed decades before, and giving him the chance to finally answer it as himself. But to feel the full weight of what he was about to confess, you have to understand what that name actually meant. Because Jacob was not a neutral word. It was not just a label his parents picked. It was a description, almost an accusation. And Jacob had spent his entire life trying to outrun it. Go back to the very beginning, to the day the twins were born. Esau came first, red and covered in hair. And then his brother came out gripping Esau's heel. That grip is where the name comes from. In Hebrew, the word for heel is akev, and the name they gave the second twin, Yaakov, is bound up with that image. The one who grabs the heel grabber. But the word carried a second meaning, and this is the one that would follow him for the rest of his life. To grab someone's heel in Hebrew thought was to trip them, to supplant them, to take what should have gone to them by grabbing from behind. When Esau finally understood what his brother had done, he cried out with a bitter kind of wordplay. Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. The supplanter, the one who wins by grabbing. So sit with the horror of the moment at the river. God asks his name. And to answer honestly, Jacob has to look at the one who made him and say out loud a word that means deceiver. Heel grabber, the one who takes what isn't his. He had to confess his whole life in a single word, and here's what makes it heavier. The name wasn't a lie, it was true. Every chapter of his story had proven it, but this is where we have to be careful, because it would be easy and lazy to turn Jacob into a simple villain. The cheat, the con man, the bad brother. And that is not who the text gives us. Jacob is more complicated than that and far more human, because he wasn't chasing worthless things. He wanted the blessing, and the blessing was real. He wanted the birthright, and God had genuinely chosen him to carry the promise given to Abraham. He wasn't wrong to want it. God himself had said the older would serve the younger. Jacob had faith. He believed the promise mattered. He believed it was worth everything. The problem was never the wanting. The problem was the how, because Jacob believed the promise. But he did not trust God to deliver it. So again and again he reached out and grabbed it himself. He would take the thing God had already promised to give him rather than wait to receive it. That is the pattern. That is the wound underneath every scene of his life. And once you see it, you can trace it through his entire story like a thread. Look at the pattern and don't rush it. Because a pattern is only frightening when you see how consistent it is. It starts before he can even speak. His very first act, still wet from birth, is to grab, not to cry, not to breathe, to reach out and seize his brother's heel, as if trying to pull himself into first place before he's taken a single breath. His whole life is written into that one image. Ask yourself the question that unlocks every scene from here. How is Jacob trying to control his identity or seize his future instead of receiving it? Watch it happen again. Years later, Esau stumbles in from the field, exhausted and starving, and Jacob is standing there with a pot of stew already cooking. And instead of simply feeding his brother, he sees an opening. He makes Esau swear away his birthright first. He turns his brother's hunger into leverage. He bought the future instead of trusting God to give it to him. Grab the heel. Take what's promised. Don't wait. Then comes the tent, the goat skins, the stolen blessing, the moment we already saw. He lies to his own dying father's face and steals the words meant for his brother. And it works. He gets the blessing. But look at what it costs. He has to run for his life. Esau wants him dead. And the man who spent everything to grab the promise now has to flee the very land the promise was about. Even in the moment he wins, he loses. That is the tragedy of grabbing. You can hold the blessing in your hand and still end up running through the dark with nothing. And running is where he stays. 20 years with his uncle Laban, and here God does something almost poetic. He sends the grabber to live with a bigger grabber. Laban tricks Jacob on his wedding night, swapping one daughter for another. Laban changes his wages 10 times. The deceiver spends 2 decades being deceived, watching his own tactics used against him, and slowly, learning what it feels like to be on the other side of the grip. By the time he finally leaves, he's wealthy. He has a family. He has everything the promise said he would have. And yet he's still doing the same thing. Because when he hears that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men, watch what Jacob does. He doesn't rest in the promise. He manages. He divides his family into 2 camps so that if one is attacked, the other might escape. He sends wave after wave of gifts ahead of him. Goats, sheep, camels, cattle, spaced out to soften his brother's anger before they ever meet face to face. He calculates. He strategizes. He tries to control the outcome the only way he's ever known. And that is the man who arrives at the river Jabbok. Not a young con artist anymore. An old man, tired of running, still gripping, still grabbing, still trying to arrange his own survival. He sends everyone across the water ahead of him. And then, for the first time in the whole story, he is completely alone in the dark. That's when the wrestling begins. And that's when, at the very end of it, the question comes. What is your name? Do you see now why the question is so devastating? God isn't asking for a word. He's holding up a mirror to a lifetime. He is asking a man who has spent decades taking, disguising, controlling, and grabbing to finally stop managing his image and say the true thing about himself out loud. And before we reach the moment he answers, if this story is doing something to you, if you're starting to see your own reflection in a man who kept grabbing at things he could have simply waited to receive, do me a favor. Drop a comment below with the one word that's been your name lately, the thing you've been running from. And if this is landing, hit like, because it genuinely helps these overlooked stories reach the people who need them. Now, the answer, because here it is. The whole night, the whole life comes down to this one exchange. What is your name? And Jacob says it. Jacob. That's it. That's the whole answer. One word. And you have to understand how much that one word costs him and how much it doesn't contain. He doesn't say Esau this time. The lie he told his father decades ago, the borrowed name, the stolen identity. He doesn't reach for it. There's no disguise left. But look closer, because it's what he doesn't add that matters most. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't defend the birthright deal. He doesn't say, well, God did promise it to me, so technically I was owed it. He doesn't tell the long story about Laban to prove he'd suffered too. He doesn't manage his image. He doesn't spin it. For the first time in his entire life, Jacob stops negotiating who he is. He just says the name, the true one, the heavy one, the one that means deceiver. He picks up the whole weight of his history and hands it over without a single excuse attached. And this is the thing most people miss when they read this scene quickly. God did not need Jacob to say his name so that God could learn something. God needed Jacob to say his name so that Jacob could finally stop hiding from it. Let that reframe the entire night for you. The wrestling wasn't God trying to defeat Jacob. The question wasn't God trying to expose Jacob. It was God refusing to let go of a man until that man could finally be honest about who he had become. God already knew who Jacob was. Jacob was the one who needed to admit it, and the moment he does, the moment the confession leaves his mouth, everything changes. Because God doesn't respond the way you might expect. He doesn't say, yes, you're a deceiver, and now you'll pay for it. He doesn't recite the list of everything Jacob has ever done wrong. The confession isn't met with a sentence. It's met with a gift. God gives him a new name. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. A new name, a whole new identity, spoken over a man still lying wounded in the dirt, still bleeding from the fight, still holding on. But before you turn this into a tidy story about a bad man who instantly became a perfect one, stop, because that's not what the text does. And what actually happens next is stranger and far more beautiful than a clean, happy ending. Because here is the detail almost everyone overlooks. Here is the detail almost everyone overlooks. Even after that night, even after the new name, the blessing, the wound, the whole transformation, the Bible keeps calling him Jacob. Not once by accident, over and over. In the very next chapters, God himself still says Jacob. The narrator still says Jacob. Later, when God speaks to him again at Bethel and formally confirms the name Israel, the text still goes back to calling him Jacob afterward. The two names live side by side for the rest of his life, all the way to his deathbed. He dies as both. Now sit with what that means, because it is one of the most quietly powerful things in all of Scripture. God did not erase the old name. He added a new one beside it. If transformation meant pretending the past never happened, God would have deleted Jacob entirely. He would have wiped the record clean, and we'd only ever hear Israel from that night forward. But that's not what grace does here. Grace doesn't require you to lie about who you were in order to become who you're meant to be. God let the old name stand. He just refused to let it be the only name. Think about what that would have felt like for Jacob. He spent his whole life terrified of that name being true, running from it, disguising it, grabbing and scheming to become someone who deserved better. And in the end, the freedom he was looking for didn't come from the name disappearing. It came from God speaking a new one over it, without demanding that the old one be hidden first. The heel grabber didn't have to become someone else before he could be blessed. He had to become honest. And then he was given something new to grow into. And that new name is its own mystery, because Israel is not as simple as it looks. Here we have to be careful and honest about what the text does and doesn't say. The Bible gives us a meaning directly. God says the name is connected to the idea that Jacob has striven with God and with men and has prevailed. The root behind the name carries the sense of struggling, wrestling, contending. So at the plain level of the story, Israel means something like he who struggles with God, or God struggles, a name born directly out of the fight at the river. Now, scholars have debated the exact linguistics of the name for a very long time, and the honest answer is that the precise etymology isn't perfectly settled. Some read it as one who strives with God. Some read the divine name as the subject rather than the object. That's a real discussion, and we don't need to pretend it away. But we also don't need to get lost in it, because the narrative meaning is crystal clear, and it's the point. Whatever the deepest root, the story is telling us this: the man whose old name meant he grabs from behind is given a new name that means he wrestles face to face. Do you feel the difference? That's the entire transformation in 2 words. The old Jacob won by grabbing heels. From behind, in the dark, through the disguise, by taking what he could reach without ever being seen. The new Israel is defined by a struggle that happens face to face, in the open, holding on and refusing to let go until the blessing comes honestly. He stopped grabbing from behind. He started wrestling in front. And that shift from grabbing to facing is exactly what gets tested the very next morning. Because there is one more scene, and it's the one that proves the change was real. Remember, this whole night happened because Esau was coming, 400 men. The brother Jacob had wronged, the one who once wanted him dead, the face Jacob had been too afraid to see for 20 years. All that dividing of the camps, all those waves of gifts. It was all fear of one face. And now, the morning after the river, that face finally arrives. Watch what the changed man does. The old Jacob would have hidden behind the herds and the servants and the gifts, managing from a distance. But the text says Jacob himself goes out in front and bows to the ground 7 times as he approaches his brother. No disguise, no stand-in, no trick. He walks toward the very face he spent decades running from, and Esau runs to meet him and embraces him, and they weep. The dreaded reckoning becomes a reunion, and then Jacob says something so startling it should stop you cold. He looks at the brother he betrayed and says, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God." Read that again. The night before, Jacob had said of the river, "I have seen God face to face, and my life was preserved." And he named that place accordingly. And now, the very next day, he looks at Esau, the human being he feared most, and uses almost the same words. Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. Here's a reading the text opens up, offered as a spiritual and narrative reflection rather than a claim the verse spells out directly. It's almost as if Jacob couldn't face the brother he feared until he had faced the God he was hiding from. He couldn't stop running from Esau until he stopped running from himself. The man who could not look his brother in the eye for 20 years could finally do it, but only after the night he finally told the truth about his own name. Maybe that's the order of things. Maybe you have to stop running from who you are before you can stop running from what you fear. And if that sentence landed somewhere real in you, I think I know why. Because this was never only Jacob's story. There's a particular kind of person who finds a story like this and can't look away. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've been praying for God to change a situation, to fix the circumstance, to move the mountain, to make the hard thing stop, and it hasn't stopped, and you've started to wonder if he's even listening, if maybe he's wrestling against you instead of for you. But look again at the river. Jacob asked for a blessing. What he got first was a question about his own name. Maybe you've been asking God to change your circumstances, while God has been using your circumstances to bring you to the one question you've been avoiding. What is your name? Not the name on your ID. The real one. The one that describes what you've become while you were surviving. Because a lot of us are living under a name we're terrified of saying out loud. Maybe your name has been the one who always has to control it. Maybe it's been the one who performs so no one sees the cracks. Maybe it's the one who cheated to get here, or the one who's still ashamed of that year, or the one who's convinced a theist that if people saw the real me, they'd leave. And you've spent so much energy managing the image, dividing the camps, sending the gifts ahead, arranging things so nobody ever gets close enough to see. Here's what this story says to that. God is not asking your name because he's trying to catch you. He already knows. He has always known. He knew before you dressed it up. The question isn't for his information, it's for your freedom. Because the thing you're most afraid to admit is the exact thing he's waiting to bless. But he won't bless the disguise. He'll only bless the man who finally takes it off. And maybe your deepest struggle right now isn't figuring out what God wants to do. Maybe it's simpler and harder than that. Maybe it's just being willing to say out loud, in the dark, who you actually became while you were trying to survive. So let's come all the way back to where we started. The question that shouldn't exist. What is your name? At the beginning, it looked almost silly. Why would God ask something he obviously already knew? But look at everything we've walked through. He knew the name. He knew the history. He knew the lie told to a blind father in a dark tent. He knew the stolen birthright, the 20 years of running, the camps and the gifts and the fear. He knew every heel Jacob ever grabbed. He knew all of it completely. And he asked anyway, which means the question was never for God. It was never about the information. Here is the great inversion the whole night was building toward. The question wasn't about the name Jacob carried. It was about the identity Jacob was finally willing to admit. God didn't ask so he could find out who Jacob was. He asked so Jacob could stop hiding from it and receive a new name he could never have grabbed for himself. You cannot receive a new name while you're still pretending to be someone else. The blessing was always waiting. It was the confession that had to come first. So before you go, 2 things. If any part of this reached you tonight, leave a comment and tell me, which name have you been afraid to say out loud? You don't have to explain it. Just naming it is the whole point. And if this gave you something, hit like, because it genuinely helps this reach the next person sitting alone in their own dark, holding on and waiting for morning. And don't leave yet, because there's another story I've placed on the screen right now, one that goes even deeper into what God does with the people he refuses to let go of. Tap it and keep going, because here is the last thing I want you to carry with you. God knew the name, he knew the history, he knew the lie, he knew the past, he knew exactly who Jacob was, down to the last hidden thing. And still, he asked. Maybe the question was never for God to hear the answer. Maybe it was for Jacob to finally say it. What's your name?